Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome one of our newer members, USI Insurance Services out of Troy. Welcome to the owner, Gil Bromley, and their team. And of course, we are welcoming our new member on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. You can learn more about them at consumerscu.org. So, Brian, I'm holding down the fort here in Lansing today. Where are you joining us from?
Yeah, if you can tell, maybe you can't really see out those windows, I guess, but they're very Bavarian looking. It's because I'm at Boyne, happen to be at Boyne today, and joining the Northern Lakes Economic Alliance. They have a symposium and showcase that they put on each year up here. So joining with a lot of different economic development organizations, four-county area that makes up this this organization, and a lot of the small businesses that make the economy here go. And I'm looking forward. Actually, while I'm here, I want to check out that sky bridge that I've seen on social media. I've been just indoors since I've got here, and I haven't had a chance to eye it, but it looked pretty impressive.
We'll definitely take some photos if you get a chance to do that. You can share them with your followers. So I wasn't on last week's show. Kelly Saunders filled in for me, but you and Kelly previewed the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference outcomes on that show, and just wanted to do some follow-ups there. Were there any surprises, and what economic insights did we learn?
Well, first of all, there were no big surprises. The Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference did actually take a little bit of the edge off the revenue cut that in the growth. And I say cut, I should put that in, that's like in government terms. It doesn't mean that the revenue coming in will be lower. It means the size of the surplus is smaller, but essentially the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference was about 1.8 billion less than what was projected back in January. You might recall, if you watched last week, that the House and the Senate were predicting 2.3 and 2.4 billion less. So a pretty big difference in that, but not a massive swing in terms of the overall budget. And I would call it a relatively upbeat forecast. And it was kind of ironic because in the past, the bane of Michigan's existence during slowdowns globally and nationally have been our concentration on the automobile industry. For the next few years, however, because there's such a backlog at work, even with a slowdown, that work should be very steady. And so the economists that presented before the joint meeting of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees suggested that the concentration of the automotive industry in Michigan would actually be a buffer to a slowdown that the rest of the country might be more likely to experience. It doesn't mean we won't have a slowdown here. It means that this backup and backlog of work in the automotive industry might actually carry us through the worst of it.
So on the other side, are there any potential risks that we need to be concerned about?
The part that caught my eye, that what I would say would be the most concerning, the most negative, was just that there was a projection that our residents' standard of living is likely more at risk and likely to decline for a while. And that really has to do with higher prices being projected to overcome rising wages. So as these efforts are taken to try to get inflation under control, we've seen, and anybody who's a longtime watcher of the briefing knows that inflation has been stubborn, that it's remained at an uncomfortably high level, even though it finally slipped a little bit below 5% overall year over year. It still is at a place where it's likely for the next year or two that inflation will grow at rates that are higher than wage growth. And that means that overall that the real income, the disposable income and the real income that people make is at risk of actually declining during that time period. So whereas the overall picture that the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference painted was, I would say, generally upbeat, generally positive. The for individuals, looking to get ahead, given that dynamic between projected wage growth and inflation, it's going to be pretty tight for the next few years.
All right, let's shift the conversation to some international issues, specifically supply chains. We're seeing some healing happening with supply chains, but the world leaders are really shifting their focus now on how to limit risks within that global supply chain. So what does that mean?
Yeah, as the leaders around the globe right now are meeting on a variety of different issues, supply chain is high in that list. And it's because there's what you see happening in this country, this move toward electrification, that's happening all over the world. And so there's this concern about how much of that supply chain that China controls. And it's something that the United States and Europe have in common, in trying to make sure that they can lock down the types of materials and elements that they need in order to accomplish these goals. And it's just clear that in a lot of cases that we're just a little behind. So there's a lot of aggressive movement, but not necessarily the supply chains locked down to ensure that it happens smoothly, or we don't have undue reliance on countries that are not reliable. And that's not to say that these elements are sourced in China. It's to say that that they've made really smart investments in locking down agreements in places where these elements come from. So things like nickel, for example, or copper, the lithium, where these literally come out of the ground, mining come out of the ground. They've really just had more foresight and have more control over that. It's also, I think, that a lot of the Western countries now are looking at how do they deal with the fact that some of these countries that have that do have these elements are starting to nationalize those types of businesses. In other words, business-owned entity or government-owned business entities to control mining and distribution. And that means that factors other than economic factors will determine that how things are distributed in the future. I bring this up mainly because it's none of this is a surprise. This is something that people have known about for some time, but the geopolitical politics are as complicated as they've ever been. And a lot of the goals of our government here in the U.S. are really dependent on these supply chains being secured in the future. And so I definitely see a big shift toward trying to de-risk some of that and put, at least for the next few years, more agreements in place around the globe that will make it possible to reach some of these electrification goals. But short of doing that, it really does put some of these goals, while they're well-intentioned, may hit brick walls if it's literally not possible to get the elements out of the ground from around the world in order to make it happen.
And can you talk a little bit about how that might impact us here in Michigan?
Michigan is in a particularly interesting position when it comes to the direction that the world is going with respect to electrification. There is a U.S. Geological Survey report that it's an estimate. So you never know exactly what's in the ground, but they estimate based on what they know of geology, what might be in the ground. And they believe that undiscovered nickel in northeast Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the western upper peninsula is very, very significant. And nickel is one of those elements that they really need to pull off this switch to battery technology in our economy more broadly with transportation and everything else. However, it would require a pretty big attitude change toward mining. I mean, mining is a very sensitive environmental operation as well, especially for something like nickel. So there are very, very stringent regulations, as there would have to be in order to do that. But even with those regulations, I think it's very likely in a country like ours that this kind of not in my backyard type of a sentiment will show up. It generally does. And it's why you see much more mining countries, more developed countries, rely on underdeveloped countries where they don't have all the rules and environmental protections. And so I think it really is going to be one of those scenarios where policymakers here in this country are going to have to decide whether or not they want to get elements and have reliance on other countries, and some might say exploit other countries that don't have the environmental controls, or to allow it here with the stringent environmental controls. So, places like Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the western UP, strong mining cultures there. I think in the local population, you probably won't find a resounding not in my backyard type of an attitude when it comes to mining. The history of mining runs very, very deep there, but there are likely to be environmental conflicts over this, and a portion of Michigan, the western half of the UP in particular, is likely to be at the center of that debate.
All right. Well, let us take a look now at our Data Monday report.
All right. I'm going to get into a few items here with respect to Data Monday, and my computer's just being a little weird here at the moment. Just, being up north doesn't always work smoothly. All right. So I thought what I would do is lean into a little bit the what's happening in financing, access to capital, and capital markets interest rates, since we are pretty well now into this cycle. And you can see what the things that people borrow more often for. This is from the University of Michigan's buying conditions indexes. So I've got on here vehicles, houses, and large household durable items. You can see all are down, but actually they look pretty stable. So they have fallen and have been jumping up and down in relatively their same types of areas. But you see the lowest being in the orange line being the buying conditions for houses. So buying conditions way down. Now, here we have residential real estate as a share of in the share of loan volume, and in this case, I wanted to just show the difference between the trends between commercial borrowing and residential real estate borrowing. So residential real estate borrowing is year over year back at zero. And that's not surprising. It dropped way down in the winter and interest rates were going up. But in the springtime, and there's a little more demand for housing and transactions in that way. It looks like it's back up. You see that blue line back up, but I just want to stress back to zero on the index. But commercial real estate volume still down quite a bit, 20% from the previous year. Now, in the next slide, we have the conditions for borrowing. So total loan demand, and which is way down, but in this last month it jumped up a little bit, but again, still way down from before. And credit standards and terms, according to consumer surveys, not surprising, down. Interest rates likely to be higher for a while, and tightening standards of banks have really changed the sentiment toward borrowing. Looking at the mortgage origination, and this was, I thought, pretty interesting. The New York Federal Reserve put this out. The loan volume according to credit score, and you can see across the board, everything's down. But for those who have excellent credit, 760 or higher in the green, look at this precipitous drop. So the ones who have the most options are borrowing a lot less when it comes to originating more mortgages. And so this would suggest that that consumers are just, these are borrowers that would have options still, would still be able to get a mortgage fairly easily and are choosing not to do it, which says that the supply and demand levers that the Federal Reserve is pulling, they're having an impact. Now, what does the market expect? This in the orange is what the Fed funds rate that the market was predicting just at the beginning of this month. And it was that it would start going, that interest rates had peaked and that they were going to start coming down as of third quarter of this year. But markets have changed their attitude a bit since the last Federal Reserve meeting, and still show by the end of the year rates starting to come down. Again, these are predictive markets, but an assumption now that's kind of being baked into the system that interest rates will stay high, not really get much higher, but stay high for a while. Now, two other slides to go here, and the first is on I thought pretty interesting when it comes to cities. We talked a little bit last week about net migration from cities. And if you were to look, and there's kind of a tale of two cities, I guess, but two types of cities, the 12 most expensive large metro areas. Here's a look at the domestic migration. So this is the net loss of residents in the 12 largest cities. And you'll see that it's a pretty dramatic decline. It would include places like New York and Los Angeles. But if you looked at the next 41, then you see something totally different. And that in these cases, you see that these cities actually aren't shrinking the same way that the very, very large cities are shrinking. So I think it's generally a pretty good indication here that that while we have some issues with cities, we do not have an issue with all cities. That this is something that is only partially impacting the most populated areas in our state. And it's just one of these weird things there about being up north. It's not responding to me stopping the share. So just a weak signal, but I feel thankful that it's not freezing up, at least, in that we're able to continue here on the broadcast.
All right. Yes, it kind of showed end screen sharing for a second, and then it decided it really wanted to end on that slide. And so we're almost done. I just wanted to let everyone know that we do have an upcoming owner-to-owner event. Again, these owner-to-owner events are peer networking events. This one is June 7th in Saginaw. You can learn more on our website, sbam.org/events. But if you're a small business owner in the Saginaw area, we would love to connect with you then. Have a great week. We'll be back here Thursday at 3 p.m.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.